Welcome back to Kural inspired stories, where ancient wisdom meets thrilling time travel adventures. I'm your host, Rashani, and today we're diving into episode 3, The Lotus Path and the Eternal Wisdom, a story filled with mystery, forgotten cities, and timeless truths. And if you want to read along with Kia and Neo, grab your copy of the book on Kindle or in paperback, available now on Amazon. The link is in the description. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Introduction. It had been a week since Kia and Neo had returned from Vidharma. At first, they couldn't stop thinking about it. The maze, the mirror of action, the people who had forgotten themselves. They had spent the first few days whispering about it, running through everything they had seen, trying to hold on to the feeling of adventure. But now it felt like a half-remembered dream. Neo lay stretched out on the woven mat in Party's shed, lazily flipping through a book. The midday heat outside was unbearable, and even the occasional breeze through the open window did little to help. Party had never discussed the shed with them, but there was an unsaid understanding that this was their new favourite place to escape the sun. Kia sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, carefully sketching a detailed drawing of Party's village. If they ever saw him again, she planned to gift it to Thirukkural. Her pencil scratched softly against the paper, filling in the outlines of coconut trees and the curved roofs of the village houses. She didn't realize how lost in thought she was until she heard it, a low, distant whisper. She froze. Neo, flipping another page of his book, didn't seem to notice. Then, without warning, a sudden gust of wind swept through the shed, stronger than anything the open window could explain. Whoosh! The stack of Party's old books toppled over, spilling across the floor. Kia and Neo snapped their heads up, eyes wide. The books lay in a messy pile, their pages fluttering wildly in the wind, except for one. One book remained completely still, even though the wind still blew. Its pages didn't move. A single symbol was drawn in the center of the open page, a lotus, and beneath it, a phrase written in ink that looked fresh, though neither of them had touched the book. Seek the feet of the one who sits on the lotus, and you shall walk a path that never ends. A chill ran down Kia's spine. Neo slowly sat up. Tell me you're seeing this? Kia swallowed hard. Yeah, she whispered. I see it. Then, as if the world had been waiting for them to notice, the mirror in the corner shimmered. Just for a second. Its surface rippled like water, disturbed by an unseen force. Neo's breath caught. Okay, that's new. Kia's heart pounded. It had been a week of silence, and now something was calling them back. But to where? And why? They had no idea, but they were about to find out. Chapter 1, The Call of the Lotus. The mirror shimmered again. Kia and Neo exchanged a look. The last time they had entered, they faced an endless maze, a city of illusions, and a kingdom lost in its own reflection. Now something else awaited them. Neo hesitated. Do you think it's going to be dangerous this time? Kia ran her fingers over the inked lotus in the book, tracing its shape. I don't know, she admitted, but we have to go, don't we? Neo let out a slow breath and nodded. Together, they stepped forward. The moment they touched the mirror, the world shifted. Not like before. This time, it felt like they were falling in slow motion, moving through layers of time rather than space. Past, present, and future blurred together. Flashes of places and people they didn't recognize flickering in and out of existence. Then, silence. When they opened their eyes, they found themselves standing in the middle of a vast temple, or at least what remained of one. The stone walls were cracked and crumbling, vines weaving through the once grand pillars. Faded murals covered the ceilings, depicting a great figure seated upon a lotus, his form half erased by time. Neo turned in a slow circle. Where are we? Kia knelt, pressing her fingers against the temple floor. It was warm, too warm, almost like it was alive. The temple is fading, she murmured. And it was true. Some parts of the temple looked ancient, barely holding together. Other parts were vanishing entirely, as if time itself had decided they no longer belonged. A dripping sound echoed through the air. Drip, drip, drip. At the far end of the temple, a giant stone lotus sat at the center of the room, surrounded by a shallow pool of water. Its petals were withered, cracked, and broken. The water beneath it wasn't still. It was rippled, unstable, shifting in and out of reality. Neo stepped forward cautiously. Why does this place feel so wrong? Before Kia could answer, a voice spoke. You should not be here. The voice was low and quiet, but it echoed through the temple as though the walls themselves were speaking. Kia and Neo turned. A man sat near the lotus pool, cross legged, on a raised stone platform. His robes were faded, his skin worn with age, and his eyes held a strange light, as if he had seen centuries pass before him. He watched them with an expression neither welcoming nor unkind. Neo swallowed. Who are you? The man exhaled softly. I am the last. Kia frowned. The last what? The last devotee. His gaze flickered to the crumbling lotus behind him, the final one to walk the lotus path. A cold wind swept through the temple, though there were no windows, no doors. Kia shivered. What happened here? The last devotee ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the stone beneath him, as if remembering something distant. This temple was once a place of eternal wisdom, he said. It stood beyond time because it carried the knowledge of those who sought the one seated upon the lotus. His voice grew quieter, but the people stopped coming. The words sent a shiver down Kia's spine. Neo shifted uneasily. Why? Why did they stop? The last devotee looked at them for a long time. Because they forgot. His words hung in the air, heavy, unmoving. They stopped seeking wisdom, he continued. They sought power instead, or wealth, or comfort. They believed they no longer needed the path, and so he gestured around them. The lotus path was lost, and with it, time itself began to fade. Kia felt a deep unease settle in her chest. If people stop following wisdom, she said slowly, trying to piece it together, then time starts disappearing. The last devotee nodded once. Neo's voice was quiet. Is that why parts of the temple are missing? Yes, the man said simply. This place is tied to wisdom. When wisdom is forgotten, so is this temple. Kia looked up at the faded murals. The great figure seated on the lotus, once a vibrant, powerful image, was now only a shadow of what it had been. Neo clenched his fists. That's not fair. The last devotee's eyes softened. It is not about fairness. It is simply how things are. When people stop seeking wisdom, it slips through their fingers. His gaze drifted toward the withered lotus. The only way to restore what has been lost is to walk the path again. Kia's breath caught. The lotus path? Yes. Neo raised an eyebrow. You just said the path was gone. It is. The last devotee turned his attention to them fully, his gaze deep and steady, which is why you must find it. Kia exchanged a look with Neo. There was something about this place, something about this man, that made her feel as though they had been brought here for a reason. She looked back at the crumbling lotus, the unsteady pool of water. How? She asked. The last devotee reached into his robes and pulled out a parchment. It was blank. The only way to walk a lost path, he said, handing it to Kia, is to remember it. Her fingers trembled as she took it. Neo frowned. What does that even mean? The last devotee's expression was unreadable. You will see. The temple shuddered as though time itself was struggling to hold it together. Kia looked down at the empty parchment. To find the lotus path, they would need to trace the steps of those who once walked it. But where would they even begin? Neo exhaled. I have a feeling this is going to be harder than last time. Kia tightened her grip on the parchment. Then we'd better get started. The temple groaned again, the murals flickered, as if the world itself was waiting for their first step. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them shifted, and they were falling. Chapter 2. The City of the Forgotten. Kia's stomach lurched as the ground beneath them vanished. She tried to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing except the weightless feeling of falling through time. The world around them shifted, flickered, unraveled. She heard Neo shouting, but his voice warped and stretched like it was being pulled in different directions. Then they landed. The first thing Kia noticed was the silence. No birds, no wind, no voices, just stillness. She sat up slowly, dust clinging to her clothes. Neo groaned next to her, rubbing his head. Okay, he muttered, that was worse than last time. Kia ignored him, looking around. They were in the middle of a massive city. The streets were paved with smooth white stone, lined with towering pillars and archways. Everything about it looked grand, ancient, important, and yet something was wrong. The city was not abandoned, not entirely. Figures stood along the streets, people, but they weren't moving. They weren't speaking or walking or breathing. They were frozen in time. Nia's voice was a whisper. Kia, are they statues? Kia wasn't sure. She stepped closer to one, a woman in flowing robes, her hands raised as if she had been speaking. She was so still, too still. Nia reached out hesitantly and touched the woman's arm. Stone, but not cold, lifeless stone. It was as if she had just turned to stone a moment ago, as if she was still waiting to move. Kia swallowed hard. They're not statues. Neo exhaled shakily. Then what are they? A voice behind them answered. They are forgotten. Kia and Neo spun around. A figure stood in the middle of the street, an old man, his long white beard flowing down to his chest, his robes lined with intricate script. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his eyes, his deep, knowing eyes, looked right through them. Kia's breath caught in her throat. Neo took a step forward. No way, he whispered. The man tilted his head, studying them. Who are you? He asked. His voice was calm but uncertain. Neo swallowed. You don't. You don't remember us? The old man blinked slowly. Then he shook his head. I do not remember much of anything. Kia felt her chest tighten, because this wasn't just any old man, it was him, the very person they had travelled through time to meet before. It was Thiruvallavar, and he had forgotten them. Kia's mind raced. How could Thiruvallavar himself, the greatest sage, the one who had written the very words they followed, be here? And worse, how could he have forgotten? Neo's voice was tight. Do you remember your name? Thiruvallavar was silent. Then, after a long pause, he said softly, I once had a name. He looked down at his hands. But it has been lost to time. Kia felt a deep pang of sorrow. She thought of the last devotee's words. When wisdom is forgotten, so is this place. When people stop seeking it, even the greatest truths become empty echoes. That was why the city had frozen. The philosophers, the teachers, the seekers of truth, they had been forgotten, and now even Thiruvallavar himself was fading from existence. Kia clenched her fists. This wasn't right. Wisdom didn't just disappear, it didn't just fade, it had to be remembered, it had to be spoken. She turned to Neo. Say it, she whispered. Neo blinked. Say what? His name. Neo hesitated, then he took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady and clear. Thiruvallavar. The air trembled. Kia stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly, and said it too. Thiruvallavar. And then, as if the very world had been waiting, the city shook, the still figures stirred, and Thiruvallavar breathed in sharply, as if waking from a deep sleep. Golden light rippled across the buildings, climbing up the archways and walls, seeping into the streets. The frozen figures began to move. A man lifted his head, blinking. A woman lowered her hands from where she had once been speaking, finishing a sentence centuries too late. The philosophers, the guides, the forgotten ones, they were returning, and in the middle of it all, Thiruvallavar stood taller, stronger, more alive than before. His eyes, once clouded, now shone with deep knowing. He looked at them and smiled. You remember me? Kia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. How could we forget? She whispered. Thiruvallavar nodded slowly. Then the path is not lost. The golden light settled, and the city stood alive once more. Neo looked around. What now? Thiruvallavar stepped forward, extending his hand. In this world, memory is wisdom, he said, and wisdom is eternity. He turned his palm upward, and a small golden lotus bloomed in his hand. Neo and Kia watched in awe as the lotus slowly floated into the air, spinning gently. And then it split into three petals. Each one drifted in a different direction. one toward the east, one toward the west, and one straight ahead. Thiruvalluvar looked at them. There are still pieces missing, he said. The Lotus Path is not whole yet. Kia swallowed. Where do we go next? Thiruvalluvar closed his eyes, listening to the whisper of the wind. Then he pointed to the petal drifting toward the east. The River of Regrets. Neo sighed. Why do these places always have names that sound terrible? Thiruvalluvar chuckled softly. Because truth is not always easy. He met their gaze, but it is always worth finding. Chapter 3: The River of Regrets. Kia and Neo stood at the edge of the city watching as the golden lotus petal floated eastward, its glow flickering against the darkening sky. Thiruvalluvar's words echoed in Kia's mind. The River of Regrets. She didn't like the sound of it. Neo sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Why does every place we go sound like it wants to mess with us? Kia didn't answer. She had a feeling this place was going to be different. Without another word, they followed the lotus petal. The further they walked, the stranger the landscape became. The once solid roads of the city faded into patches of mist, the sky shifting from day to dusk to night and back again, as if time itself couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Neo glanced at Kia. Is it just me, or does the ground feel weird? Kia frowned and looked down. Her footprints weren't staying. Each step she took vanished the moment she lifted her foot, as if she had never walked there at all. She shivered. This place didn't just feel strange, it felt wrong. Ahead, the petal floated downward, disappearing into a thick wall of grey mist. Kia and Neo exchanged a glance. Then they stepped forward, and the world changed. The mist lifted to reveal a vast river stretching into the horizon. Its water was dark, almost black, yet constantly shifting with silver ripples. But the strangest part? It didn't flow like a normal river. It moved backwards. Neo frowned. That's not right. Kia agreed. The river was moving against time, as if trying to pull everything back into the past. And then the reflections appeared. At first they were faint, like ghostly shadows beneath the surface, but as the river churned, faces emerged. People. Hundreds of them. Their eyes filled with sorrow. Their expressions were frozen in regret. Kia's stomach twisted. Who are they? A voice answered from behind them. They are those who turned away from wisdom. Kia and Neo spun around. Standing on the riverbank was a hooded figure draped in deep blue robes, their face hidden beneath the shadow of their hood. Their voice was neither old nor young, neither man nor woman, just a presence deep and knowing. Neo took a step back. And who are you? I am the guardian of the river, the figure gestured towards the water. This is where regrets flow, the unspoken, the undone, the wisdom ignored. Kia's chest tightened. These weren't just random people, they were people who had once been on the right path, had once sought wisdom, but had turned away. The river had taken their choices, doubts, and moments of hesitation and turned them into endless regret. Kia whispered, Are they trapped? The guardian nodded. They cannot move forward because they are bound to what they did not do. The reflections shifted, and suddenly Kia and Neo saw individual stories unfolding in the water. A young scholar sat in front of an open book, his hands trembling, his eyes filled with longing. But instead of reading, he closed the book and walked away. His reflection whispered, I was afraid I would never understand. The image faded, and another took its place. A woman stood before a crowd, her lips parted, her hands clutching a scroll. But instead of speaking, she lowered her gaze and turned away. Her reflection whispered, I was afraid they wouldn't listen. More and more reflections rippled to the surface. A man who had a chance to lead but chose silence over responsibility. A teacher who had the knowledge to guide others but believed her words were not important. A child who had once loved learning but let fear of failure keep him from seeking wisdom. All of them were trapped in the weight of what they had not done. Kia's throat tightened because she knew what this river really was. It wasn't just a place where people's regrets lived, It was a place where people were unable to forgive themselves. Neo's voice was barely a whisper. How do we help them? The guardian turned to them. You cannot. Neo scowled. What? But you cannot change the past, the guardian interrupted. You cannot erase regret. They gestured to the river. But you can choose to move forward. Kia frowned. How? The guardian raised their hand, and suddenly a thin stone bridge formed across the river. The river will try to pull you back, they said. It will whisper to you, call to you, make you feel the weight of what is lost. Neo looked uneasy. And if we fall in? The guardian's hood tilted slightly. Then you too will remain. A long silence. Then Kia set her jaw. She stepped onto the bridge. Neo took a breath, then followed. The moment Kia's foot touched the bridge, the voices rose, not loudly, not angrily, but softly, regretfully. You could have done more. You should have tried harder. You should have spoken up. You should have listened. The whispers wrapped around her, curling into her mind. She gritted her teeth, gripping the edges of the bridge. The river was not just showing them other people's regrets, it was pulling up their own. Kia saw flashes of her own past, moments when she had held back, moments when she had doubted herself. Nia froze beside her, staring down at the river. His face had gone pale. Kia grabbed his wrist. Don't look, she said. Don't listen. Neo blinked rapidly, shaking his head. It's too loud. Kia squeezed his hand. We keep moving. She took another step forward, then another. The voices grew softer and the images dimmed. With each step, the whispers faded. And then they reached the other side. The moment their feet touched solid ground, the bridge crumbled behind them. The whispers vanished. The guardians stood waiting. You understand now, they said. Neo exhaled sharply. That was awful. The guardian nodded. The weight of regret is heavy, but those who walk forward will never be bound by it. Kia turned back towards the river. The figures in the water watched them, their eyes filled with longing. She wished she could tell them that they still had a choice, that wisdom could always be found again. But she couldn't. They had to choose it for themselves. The guardian lifted their hand. The second lotus petal lifted from the river, drifting forward. Kia and Neo watched it float towards the mist ahead. The silent monastery, the guardian said. Kia squared her shoulders. Neo groaned. I swear, if this one is worse. Kia smiled slightly. We'll face it, just like we did this one. And together they walked forward. Chapter 4. The Silent Monastery. The mist thickened around them as Kia and Neo followed the last lotus petal drifting ahead. Unlike the river's dark, shifting waters, this place felt calm. But it wasn't a comforting calm. It was the kind of silence that made the air feel too still, as if even the wind had forgotten to breathe. Neo shoved his hands into his pockets. I don't like this. Kia nodded, eyes scanning the thick fog ahead. Yeah, something feels off. The lotus petal floated higher and then disappeared, and in front of them the mist cleared, revealing the silent monastery. The monastery stood at the top of a steep stone staircase, its walls built from smooth, pale stone, with intricate carvings woven into the pillars. The carvings weren't just patterns, they were words etched into every surface. But the strangest part? The monastery was open. Its massive wooden doors stood wide, yet no sound came from within. Kia glanced at Neo. No guards. Neo frowned. No people at all. Kia exhaled and started up the stairs. Each step felt heavy. Not physically, but in a way she couldn't quite explain, as if she were walking into something far older than herself. Neo followed, his usual chatter absent. When they reached the entrance, they peered inside, and what they saw made Kia's breath catch. Inside the monastery, dozens of figures sat in neat rows, dressed in simple robes. Their backs were straight and their eyes were closed, not sleeping, not frozen in time, simply silent, still. Not one of them moved. Neo let out a slow breath. Are they meditating? Kia nodded. I think so, but it wasn't like any meditation she'd ever seen. These monks weren't just silent with their mouths, they were silent with their whole being. There was no shuffling of robes, no twitching of fingers, no furrowed brows in deep thought. They were in absolute stillness. A single candle burned at the center of the monastery, its flame barely flickering, as if even the air refused to disturb this place. Kia's skin prickled. Something was here. Something powerful. As they stepped forward, Neo reached out and ran his fingers over the stone wall. He frowned. Kia! She turned. What? He pointed at the engraved words on the wall. They're changing. Kia stepped closer. The words weren't static carvings, they were shifting, rearranging. New words formed before their eyes. She read them aloud. Silence is not empty. Silence is where truth is found. Neo stared. That's a bit creepy. But Kia's pulse quickened because she understood. This place wasn't testing them like the others had. The city had tested memory. The river had tested regret. But this was testing their understanding. Kia turned towards the monks. She had expected them to teach her something, to speak wisdom like Thirukkural, to tell them what they needed to know. But that wasn't the lesson here. It was never about hearing wisdom from others. It was about listening to the wisdom already inside. Kia slowly sank onto the floor, crossing her legs. She closed her eyes. Neo frowned. Kia? She didn't respond, because for the first time, she wasn't trying to find the answer. She was simply listening to the stillness, to the silence, to herself. At first, all she heard was the sound of her own breath. Then something deeper, a thought, not from outside herself, but from within. And suddenly she knew. She opened her eyes and looked at Neo. You need to sit. Neo scowled. You've got to be joking. But Kia just smiled and patted the floor beside her. Trust me. Neo let out a long-suffering sigh, then sank down beside her. For a moment he twitched restlessly. Then slowly he let the silence settle over him. And he listened. The moment Neo let go, the room shifted. A deep hum filled the air, not a sound from the outside world, but a resonance that seemed to come from within themselves. The monks, still silent, began to glow faintly. The words on the walls brightened, settling into place, and at the center of the monastery, the lotus petal reappeared, spinning gently above the candle. Kia smiled. Neo opened his eyes. That was weird. Kia laughed softly. That was wisdom. Neo rubbed his temples. Great, so now I know what? That I need to be quiet more? Kia shook her head. No, that the greatest truths aren't always outside us. She stood brushing the dust off her hands. They're within. Neo looked at the glowing lotus petal. Then, with a grin, he muttered, Party's going to love this. Kia chuckled. Yeah, she is. The lotus petal floated towards them, merging with the other two petals they had collected. A soft golden light pulsed through the air, and then, just like before, the mist began to clear. And standing at the exit of the monastery, waiting for them, was Thiruvallavad. Chapter 5. The Feet of the Eternal One. The great sage stood tall, his presence both calm and commanding, as if he had been watching over them the entire time. Neo exhaled. Okay, I know we just did the whole inner wisdom thing, but did you just teleport? Thiruvallavad smiled. Perhaps I was always here. Kia narrowed her eyes. That's not an answer. Thiruvallavad chuckled. No, but it is the truth. He turned his gaze towards the three glowing lotus petals that now hovered before them, each one radiating a soft golden light. You have walked the forgotten path, he said. You have restored what was lost. His eyes shone with something deeper than pride, something closer to knowing. But there is one final step before the path is whole again. He raised his hand and pointed ahead. Kia turned and gasped. The ground beneath them rippled, not like the shifting sands of the river, nor like the frozen time of the city. This was something else. The three petals began to move, spinning gently in the air, their light growing brighter and brighter, until a bridge formed before them. But it wasn't made of stone or wood. It was made of light. The bridge stretched into the horizon, floating above a vast, endless pond of stars. At the far end, in the distance, sat a single fully bloomed lotus, and seated upon it, a figure, still, radiant, waiting. Nia swallowed. That's him, isn't it? Kia nodded, the one seated on the lotus. The air hummed with energy. Tiruvallivar stepped forward, his expression unreadable. This is the final path, he said. To reach it, you must walk forward. Neo frowned. That's it, just walk. Tiruvallivar met his gaze. Yes, but only those who truly seek wisdom can take this step. Kia took a breath. The bridge looked solid, but somehow she knew it wasn't. Not in the way ordinary things were. This wasn't just about walking, this was about faith. She stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the bridge, light rippled beneath her like water. She took another step, and another. The bridge held. Neo followed, moving hesitantly at first, then more steadily as he realized the path was firm beneath his feet. The air around them felt different now, not just silent, but full. Full of everything they had learned, the wisdom of the forgotten city, the lessons of regret from the river, the inner truths discovered in silence. Every step forward was a step into understanding. And then they reached the end. The pond stretched out forever, its surface rippling with light. At the center, the great lotus bloomed, glowing with an eternal golden hue, and seated upon it was the figure they had seen in the murals, the one whose wisdom had guided seekers across time. He was neither young nor old, neither man nor god. His form was shifting, yet still distant, but close. And when he spoke, the world listened. You have walked the lost path, the voice echoed, deep and vast as the sky. You have sought wisdom, not for power nor for gain, but because wisdom itself is the path. Neo exhaled. So we did it? The one on the lotus nodded, but his eyes rested on Kia. There is something you carry, he said softly. Kia blinked. What? He lifted a hand, and the space between them shifted like a mirror, turning inward. And suddenly in Kia's hands was her drawing, the one she had made in Party's shed. Neo let out a soft whoa. Tiruvallivar stepped forward, smiling. You wished to give it to me? Kia felt a warmth rise in her chest. She had drawn it to remember, to hold on to something that mattered. Now she understood why. She stepped forward and placed the drawing into Tiruvallivar's hands. It's for you, she said, so you'll never be forgotten. Tiruvallivar's eyes softened, and for the first time the lotus itself shone brighter. The one on the lotus spoke one final time. Those who follow the feet of the one seated on the lotus shall live forever on this earth. Chapter 6. Return to the Library. The world began to shift. The stars, the bridge, the lotus, everything blurred as if dissolving into light. Kia felt the air around them pulling them back, not to Party Shed, but to Tiruvallivar's library. A warm breeze brushed against her skin, and suddenly the vast pond of stars was gone. Instead, they stood in a grand hall lined with ancient scrolls, the scent of aged parchment filling the air. The glow of oil lamps flickered along the carved wooden shelves, and in the distance a gentle wind chime tinkled softly. Kia let out a breath. Neo blinked. Okay, at least this landing was softer. Tiruvallivar turned to them, holding the drawing carefully, as though it were more valuable than gold. He stepped towards a large wooden desk where a parchment and ink lay waiting. Without hesitation, he picked up his quill. The quill hovered above the parchment, its ink glistening in the warm glow of the library's oil lamps. Kia and Neo watched, expecting Tiruvallivar to write the next Kural and complete their journey. But instead, he paused. His fingers rested lightly on the scroll, his gaze steady as he looked at them. You have walked a long journey, he said. Stay a while. There is no need to rush. Neo raised an eyebrow. You mean we don't have to leave yet? Tiruvallivar smiled. Time moves as it should, and tonight it moves slowly. Kia exchanged a glance with Neo. The adventures had been tiring, intense, eye-opening, and now for the first time they had a chance to simply exist in this place, not as travelers, not as seekers, but as themselves. She smiled. We'd like that. The warm evening air wrapped around them as they stepped out of the library and into the village beyond. It was unlike anything Kia had seen before, simple, peaceful, yet deeply alive. Houses made of wood and clay stood neatly along narrow pathways, small oil lamps flickering at the entrances. The earth beneath their feet was soft, carrying the scent of recently watered soil. Neo nudged Kia and pointed. Look at that. At the village square, a group of children sat in a circle, listening intently to an elder who was carving symbols into the dirt with a stick. His voice was calm and steady, telling a story that Kia didn't fully understand but somehow felt familiar. Thiruvalluvar followed their gaze. A story is never just words, he said softly. It is a path, one that must be walked, not just told. Nia let out a slow breath. So that's why you wanted us to walk the Lotus Path ourselves. Thiruvalluvar nodded. Wisdom cannot be learned by watching. It must be lived. Kia looked around the village at the people who lived so simply yet seemed so deeply connected to life itself. Do the people here ever leave? She asked. Thiruvalluvar smiled. Some do, some return. Some find wisdom beyond these walls, and some never need to leave at all. Neo tilted his head. And you, do you ever leave? The sage's eyes twinkled. I have never needed to. And somehow, Kia understood exactly what he meant. They followed Thiruvalluvar to a small open pavilion where a group of villagers were gathered around a fire cooking. The smell of roasted grains, spiced lentils, and fresh herbs filled the air. Neo's stomach growled loudly. Kia smirked. Guess we're staying for dinner. A young woman who had been grinding rice into flour laughed lightly. You are welcome here, she said warmly. They sat cross-legged on woven mats, the night air warm against their skin. The woman served them steaming rice, lentils, and roasted vegetables cooked in fragrant spices. The scent of curry leaves and ghee filled the air. Neo took a bite and sighed in happiness. This is amazing. Thiruvalluvar smiled. Food carries wisdom too. It teaches patience, sharing, and gratitude. Kia thought of Party, of the way she would always serve others first before eating herself. Yes, there was wisdom in that. They ate slowly, listening to the laughter of the villagers, the rustle of the evening wind, and the soft ringing of temple bells in the distance. For the first time in a long while, Kia and Neo weren't racing against time. They were simply living in it, and it felt right. When the meal was done and the fire burned low, Thiruvalluvar stood. It is time. Kia and Neo stood as well, their stomachs warm, their minds clearer than before. They followed Thiruvalluvar back to the library, walking through the quiet village, the stars bright above them. Back inside, the library was exactly as they had left it. The scroll still lay open on the desk, waiting. Thiruvalluvar sat down, dipped his quill into ink, and began to write. His hand moved with steady, graceful strokes, his expression one of quiet devotion. மலர்மிசை ஏகினான் மானடி சேர்ந்தார் நிலமிசை நீடுவாள் வார். Those who follow the feet of the one seated on the lotus shall live forever on this earth. As the ink dried, the air shifted. Kia and Neo felt it before they saw it, the familiar pull of the portal, the gentle tug of time wrapping around them. Neo grinned. Here we go again. Kia turned to Thiruvalluvar. For a moment she wanted to say something, to thank him, to tell him that she would never forget any of this, but somehow she knew he already understood. Thiruvalluvar nodded. Go well. The world around them glowed, and in the blink of an eye, they were gone. Chapter 7. The Weight of the Journey. The pull of the portal grew stronger, wrapping around Kia and Neo like a shifting current. The warm glow of Thiruvalluvar's library faded, and in the next instant they landed with a thud, back in Party's shed. Kia blinked up at the ceiling, her mind still adjusting. The scent of aged books and lamp oil from Thiruvalluvar's library still clung to her senses. Neo groaned sitting up. I don't think I'll ever get used to that. Kia let out a slow breath. They were home. And yet she placed a hand over her chest. It still felt like a part of her was back there in the silent monastery by the river of regrets, walking through the forgotten city. She wasn't sure she could ever truly leave that behind. Neo dusted himself off and glanced around. Did it even happen? But before Kia could answer, they heard the sound of pages turning. Party was sitting at her usual spot near the window, a faded book in her lap. She was flipping through its pages with the same quiet ease she always had. She didn't look up, didn't react, as if she had known they were there the whole time. Neo narrowed his eyes. Okay, how do you always know? Party's lips curved into a smile, knowing smile. I don't, she said simply. I just wait. Kia chuckled. That sounded exactly like something she would say. Party finally set the book aside and turned to them. So? Neo stretched his arms behind his head. So what? Party raised an eyebrow. What did you learn? Neo paused. He glanced at Kia. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he had learned so much it was hard to put into words. Kia ran her fingers over the wooden floor, thinking. Wisdom isn't just in books or temples, she said finally. It's in everything, in people, in the way they live. Neo nodded slowly. And it's not just about knowing things, it's about remembering. Party's eyes softened. That, she said, is a lesson worth keeping. Kia's eyes drifted to the mirror in the corner of the shed. It was still, for now, but she knew, just as Party did, that wisdom never truly disappears. It only waits, and when the time was right, the next journey would call them back. Kia smiled to herself. They would be ready. And that brings us to the end of Kia and Neo's journey along the Lotus Path and the eternal wisdom. Through forgotten temples and ancient riddles, they discovered that true wisdom isn't just something we read or hear, it's something we live. It grows from within, just like the lotus rising through the mud to bloom in the light. I hope this story left you feeling inspired and curious about the hidden wisdom all around us. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget you can grab the full book, including all the reflection and journaling activities at the back on Kindle or in paperback to read along or revisit the adventure anytime. The link is in the description. Make sure to follow the podcast and leave a review. It helps more adventurers like you join Kia and Neo on their quests. And remember, this is just one step on their journey. The next adventure is right around the corner. Until then, keep exploring, stay curious, and as always, let wisdom be your guide. See you in the next episode.